The following program contains graphic descriptions of violence and may include disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. What drives a man to commit unspeakable acts against innocent women? Welcome to Evil Exposed Killers, where we uncover the darkest and most disturbing figures in history. Today, we delve into the chilling case of Peter Sutcliffe, better known as the Yorkshire Ripper, whose reign of terror in the 1970s shocked the world and left a trail of horror across England. Peter Sutcliffe was born on June 2, 1946, in Bingley, West Yorkshire, England. The second of 6 children, Peter grew up in a working-class family where his father, John Sutcliffe, was a mill owner and his mother, Kathleen, was a homemaker. From a young age, Peter was described as a quiet and introverted child, often preferring solitude over the company of others. His father, a strong and dominant personality, was heavily involved in sports and social activities, traits Peter did not share. This difference created a rift between father and son, with Peter often feeling inadequate under his father's critical eye. As a child, Peter struggled in school. He was small, frail, and frequently targeted by bullies. His academic performance was poor, and he often withdrew into himself, finding solace in books about crime and horror. This early fascination with the macabre hinted at a darker side of Peter's personality, one that would later manifest in terrifying ways. At the age of 15, Peter left school without any qualifications and began working a series of low-paying jobs. He was a gravedigger, a factory worker, and later a lorry driver. His time as a gravedigger seemed to deepen his obsession with death as he spent hours in cemeteries, surrounded by the deceased. Colleagues would later recall how Peter would sometimes dig graves alone, even when he wasn't required to, as if he found comfort in the presence of the dead. During his early adulthood, Peter Sutcliffe's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He developed an unhealthy fixation on prostitutes, whom he frequently visited. It was during these encounters that his deep-seated anger and frustration began to surface. In 1969, Peter married Sonia Surma, a teacher of Czech and Polish descent. Their marriage was troubled from the start, partly due to Sonia's inability to have children and Peter's growing instability. Despite these issues, the couple stayed together, with Peter maintaining a facade of normalcy to those around him. But behind this veneer of an ordinary working-class man, Peter was harboring dark and violent fantasies. These fantasies would soon erupt into a series of brutal attacks that would terrorize the entire nation. Peter Sutcliffe's reign of terror began on July 5, 1975, when he attacked Anna Regulskij, a 36-year-old woman walking alone in Keighley. As she made her way down a quiet street, Peter stalked her from behind, his eyes cold and detached. Without warning, he struck her in the head with a hammer, the blow so powerful that it fractured her skull. Anna crumpled to the ground, disoriented and bleeding profusely. But Peter wasn't finished. He pulled out a knife and slashed at her with a viciousness that spoke of deep-seated rage. Her screams echoed through the empty street as he inflicted wound after wound. But by some miracle, Anna survived the attack. She was left permanently scarred, both physically and psychologically. But she lived to tell the tale. Later that year, on August 15th, he struck again. This time, his victim was 46-year-old Olive Smelt, walking home after a night out in Halifax. Peter followed her, his footsteps eerily quiet, before unleashing the same brutal attack. The hammer came down on Olive's head with bone-crushing force, splitting her scalp open. She fell to the ground, dazed and helpless. Peter, in a frenzy, slashed at her body with a knife, leaving deep gashes in her flesh. Olive survived, but like Anna, she would never fully recover from the horrors inflicted upon her. But these were just the beginning. Peter Sutcliffe was escalating, and soon he would take his first life. On October 30th, 1975, Peter targeted 28-year-old Wilma McCann in Leeds. Wilma, a mother of 4, had been out drinking and was walking home when Peter spotted her. He offered her a ride, and she, unaware of the danger, accepted. They drove to a secluded spot where Peter turned off the engine and suddenly, without a word, brought the hammer crashing down on her head. Wilma didn't have time to react. The first blow rendered her unconscious, her skull shattered under the impact. But Peter wasn't satisfied with just killing her. He dragged her limp body out of the car, onto the cold ground, and began stabbing her repeatedly in a frenzy of bloodlust. The knife plunged into her neck, chest, and abdomen, slicing through skin and muscle, hitting vital organs. By the time Peter was done, Wilma's body was a bloody, mutilated mess. Her lifeless form was found the next morning in a playing field, a horrifying testament to the brutality of her murder. The violence and savagery of Wilma's murder shocked the nation, but at the time, the police did not link it to the earlier attacks. Peter Sutcliffe, emboldened by his ability to evade capture, continued his killing spree with chilling efficiency. Over the next 5 years, Peter Sutcliffe would go on to murder 12 more women and attempt to murder at least 7 others. His victims were often vulnerable women, many of whom were sex workers. Peter would lure them into his car or attack them while they were alone on the streets. His modus operandi was always the same. He would strike his victims with a hammer, incapacitating them before using a knife or screwdriver to inflict multiple stab wounds. The level of violence in these attacks was unprecedented, and the public soon began to fear for their safety. In January 1976, Peter struck again, this time targeting 42-year-old Emily Jackson. She was working as a prostitute to help make ends meet for her family when Peter picked her up. He drove her to a derelict building, where he attacked her with his hammer, knocking her to the ground. But unlike his previous attacks, Peter had brought a screwdriver, and in a sickening escalation of violence, he used it to stab Emily multiple times. He plunged the screwdriver into her back, chest, and neck, twisting it as he drove it deeper into her flesh. The ferocity of the attack left Emily's body almost unrecognizable. Peter then dragged her body behind the building and left her to die alone in the cold, dark night. The brutality of the murders continued to escalate. In May 1976, Peter murdered Marcella Claxton, who was walking home from a party in Leeds. He offered her a ride, and when she refused, he followed her on foot. As she walked through a park, Peter struck her in the head with a hammer, but she survived the initial attack. Bleeding heavily, Marcella begged for her life, but Peter was unmoved. He dragged her into the underbrush, where he beat her further, leaving her for dead. Miraculously, Marcella survived, but she lost her unborn child due to the attack, and she would be haunted by the memories for the rest of her life. In April 1977, Peter claimed his youngest victim, 16-year-old Jane MacDonald. Jane was walking home after a night out when Peter spotted her. She was not a prostitute, and her death marked a turning point in the case, as it shattered the public's perception that only sex workers were at risk. Peter followed Jane, attacking her from behind with his hammer. The force of the blow knocked her to the ground, where he continued to bludgeon her. He then stabbed her repeatedly, his knife tearing through her flesh, severing arteries and puncturing vital organs. Jane's lifeless body was discovered the next morning, her face beaten beyond recognition. The press quickly dubbed Peter Sutcliffe the Yorkshire Ripper, a reference to the infamous Jack the Ripper, who had terrorized London nearly a century earlier. As the body count rose, so did the pressure on the police to catch the killer. The investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper became one of the largest and most extensive manhunts in British history, involving thousands of officers and countless man-hours. Despite their efforts, the police were hampered by a series of missteps, including false leads, hoax letters, and a lack of coordination between different police forces. One of the most significant blunders occurred in 1979 when the police received a series of letters and an audio tape from a man claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. The letters, signed Jack the Ripper, taunted the police and provided details of the murders that were not public knowledge. The voice on the tape had a distinct Wearside accent, and the police, convinced that this was their man, focused their investigation on suspects from that area. This led them to dismiss Peter Sutcliffe, who had been interviewed several times during the investigation, but was never considered a prime suspect because he did not fit the profile based on the hoax letters and tape. The real Yorkshire Ripper, however, continued his killing spree. On January 4, 1981, Peter Sutcliffe's reign of terror finally came to an end. Two police officers, Sergeant Robert Ring and Constable Bob Hides, stopped Peter in his car in Sheffield. He was with a woman whom the officers initially thought might be a prostitute. During questioning, Peter provided false identification, arousing the officers' suspicions. They arrested him and took him to the police station for further questioning. It was only after they searched his car and discovered a hidden compartment containing a hammer and a knife that the full extent of his depravity began to unfold. The officers, now fully aware that they had a dangerous man in custody, intensified their interrogation. Peter Sutcliffe initially tried to maintain his innocence, but the mounting evidence and relentless questioning soon broke him. Over the course of the next few days, he confessed to the murders in chilling detail. Peter calmly recounted each murder, describing how he would stalk his victims, selecting them for their vulnerability, and then attacking with a cold, methodical precision that left no room for mercy. Peter's confession was horrifying in its clinical detachment. He described how he would strike his victims from behind with a hammer, relishing the moment when they crumpled to the ground. He would then take out his knife or screwdriver and set about his gruesome work, stabbing and mutilating the helpless women. He admitted to deriving a sick pleasure from the act, driven by a twisted belief that he was ridding the world of immoral women. Peter Sutcliffe was charged with 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. His trial began on May 5, 1981, at the Old Bailey in London. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and members of the public, all eager to see the man who had brought so much fear and suffering to the nation. Despite his defense team's attempts to argue that Peter was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and should be committed to a mental institution, the jury found him guilty on all counts. The judge, Mr. Justice Borum, sentenced Peter Sutcliffe to 20 concurrent life sentences, with the recommendation that he never be released. In his sentencing remarks, the judge described Peter as an unusually dangerous man whose crimes were of appalling wickedness. Peter Sutcliffe was initially sent to Parkhurst Prison, but after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, he was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital. There, he was treated for his mental illness, though many continued to argue that his crimes were not the result of madness, but of pure evil. In 2010, after nearly 3 decades at Broadmoor, Peter was deemed mentally fit to be transferred back to a regular prison, where he remained until his death. Peter Sutcliffe died on November 13, 2020, from complications related to COVID-19. His death brought a sense of closure to some, but for many, the scars he left behind could never fully heal. The families of his victims were left to grapple with the loss of their loved ones, the horror of their final moments, and the knowledge that their lives were taken by a man driven by incomprehensible cruelty. The Yorkshire Ripper case exposed significant flaws in the British police system, particularly in the handling of serial killer investigations. The case highlighted the dangers of tunnel vision, where investigators become so focused on a particular theory or piece of evidence that they overlook other possibilities. It also underscored the vulnerability of women, particularly those working as sex workers, and the societal indifference to their safety until the murder of a respectable woman like Jane MacDonald. The legacy of Peter Sutcliffe's crimes is one of horror, fear, and sorrow. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, was a man whose monstrous actions left an indelible mark on history. His brutal crimes against innocent women revealed the darkest depths of human depravity and the devastating consequences of unchecked violence. Thank you for joining us on Evil Exposed Killers. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of the world's most infamous criminals. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. Please like and subscribe to Evil Exposed for more riveting stories.